Good morning, everybody. I'm Paul Pratt with Wrestling Inc., and we're here with Kevin McElvaney, the editor-in-chief of Pro Wrestling Illustrated. We are going to talk today about the PWI 500, which is popping off all over the world and is blowing up social media with people questioning some of the rankings, and we are going to get to the bottom of that. So first of all, Kevin, tell me a little bit, because I want to bring any of the modern listeners up to speed. What was the transition like for you coming in and sort of taking over in this iconic role as the editor-in-chief of Pro Wrestling Illustrated?
Well, I had been with the magazine freelancing on and off for over a decade. I guess it was the better part of 13 or 14 years.
Wow.
I wasn't one of the primary contributors. I wasn't a senior writer, but I did do a lot on social media, and, had consistently been contributing to the magazine. When Stu told me confidentially that he was looking to retire and that I might be a good replacement, invited me to apply, that blew my mind. I've said this before, but I grew up, as many of us did, reading the magazines, PWI, and of course, like its many sister publications. And when I came in, there was a formal application process that, we have a parent company and all that. And when I did come in, it was just, I'd been to the office before, but to be there, sitting down at Stu's desk, learning from him. And it was really just completely surreal. And the timing of it was unfortunate because I started, I believe it was March 7th of last year. So this was right before COVID, or I'm sorry, it was the 2nd. So I was in the office for a couple of weeks before it came down to, oh, is there going to be any wrestling to cover? Oh, should we even be in the office doing this? And for a while I did go and I was learning the ropes of the job remotely. Stu and I would hop on the phone all the time. We'd have video calls, and I learned a lot, of course, in the first couple of weeks I was there, but a lot of the first issue I helped put together, it was done remotely. And then when it was a little bit safer for me to come back and we at least had like separate spaces set up for the two of us and some things reconfigured in here, then, we could resume a little bit more normal activity. But even then it was a lot of like, okay, maybe we should be on the phone for this instead of face to face. So it was kind of a scary time to do it. But Stu is just such a good teacher. He knew that job inside and out. He has just such incredible recall with things from years ago. It's not to say he remembers every single thing you ask him, but like, oh yeah, I think we did a piece on them a while back. I don't know when it was. And it'll turn out it's, 15 years ago. But couldn't have learned from anybody better. He was at the helm for so many years. Never really got the credit for it. Even what I'm doing here, he was always reluctant to make public appearances, and he was much happier to send someone else to do it. And I understand that. I'm kind of an anxious guy myself. But yeah, he was happy just to do the work, and really an honor to take over from him.
So since you joined just over a year ago, maybe I guess a year and a half ago at this point, yeah, there have been some fairly sweeping changes in terms of the way that PWI presents itself, the way it embraces different communities, the way it embraces the world of wrestling today in a little bit of a different perspective. So I was wondering if you could tell us about the process of kind of evolving with the times.
Yeah, so as I said, I've been with the magazine for a long time, and I could advocate for this or that, but ultimately I was in a very low position in the hierarchy here. Other writers had more say. Certainly Stu had more say. When there were more editors on staff, they had more say. But also I think for a long time, I just kind of looked at like, okay, we're covering what wrestling is. Don't always love what wrestling is. Wrestling's not the most progressive business. Mm-hmm. Thankfully, that started to get a little better. But when I got into the editor's chair, I realized I actually had some power to change that. And I'll always use this example. A couple of years ago, people came down really hard on PWI because the 2019 ranking was particularly at a time when more emphasis was being placed everywhere on diversity and inclusion. PWI was not reflecting that. There were a lack of wrestlers of color on there, a lack of LGBTQ wrestlers. There were no women on the list at the time. We had the separate women's list, but just there were women who were competing for the same championships as men, and why were they not on the list, you know? So looking at all that, I realized, you know, hey, I'm pretty pissed off about this too. I get anywhere else this happens, you know, if there's a lack of diversity in the Academy Award nominations, Grammy nominations, on like a TV network's roster, I'm always like, well, what's this about? Why is this like, why is this so white? Why is this so straight? Why are there so many guys on this? Was very happy to be outspoken about that. And I thought like, well, PWI, again, we're covering the industry, but that's kind of a cop out. If we just say, okay, well, we're covering what's the most popular. I'm like, well, no, I mean, yes, we need to cover what's popular and what's on television, but there are a lot of other, especially if you consider the magazine's history as covering the sport of wrestling. God, there's so much out there. Mm-hmm. So that was my priority as far as that went. And I think that was the genesis of it.
So one of the things we've definitely seen is a greater like gender inclusivity in your rankings on a weekly basis. For those of you who go to the Pro Wrestling Illustrated weekly, rather, if you go to the Pro Wrestling Illustrated website, there's a weekly ranking. That's what I meant to say. And you can sort of kind of stay up to date on that as well. But even in that, there's been a much stronger emphasis on gender inclusivity, it seems like.
Yeah. So honestly, the way I look at this, a lot of the here's the men's list and here's the women's list is out of date for so many reasons. And one of those is, I mean, that understanding of gender is outdated. Not everybody fits neatly into either category. And then just within the business, you know, again, people are competing a lot of times for the same championships, especially on the independent circuit. And then also in promotions like Impact, some places in Mexico and Japan as well. Europe, I mean, really a lot of other places except for the major American promotions. And of course, you know, New Japan has historically just been a male promotion. But I lost my train of thought there a little bit. Oh yeah, the weekly ratings. So the way we approach this now, yes, there are still women's divisions out there. Like they're called that by name. There are women's championships, women's promotions. Everything's not all of a sudden completely unified, and there are still fewer opportunities for women. But the way we look at it is that overall top 10 list, I mean, even the 500, you go back to 1993, Jackie Moore was on the list. Mm-hmm. It was never until there were definitive separate men's and women's lists, and even those were not formally separated at first. That happened a little more recently, and I was tweeting about that the other day, but the way I look at it is and this, I know this is how Stu saw it as well. There's divisions. It's kind of like, yes, okay, there's the NBA and the WNBA, or different divisions in the NCAA. And wrestling, people compete in different divisions. You know, you have, we'll use an example of an independent wrestler. So Allie Catch, you know, women's champion in Pro Wrestling Magic for a bit. But she's also competing in GCW, and she's in contention for their heavyweight title, you know? So why would we say, oh, you can't be on this list? That doesn't make any sense. And more recently, I mean, we've had a few women appear in the overall weekly top 10. Most recently, Trisha Dore is the most recent example. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is the Pan-African World Diaspora Championship, which we're now recognizing on our list of official designated world championships, which for anyone who doesn't know that, that's kind of a throwback to decades and decades ago. And I know you know this, but it's the sports-like approach. It's, you know, boxing magazines used to say, this is a world championship, this is a world championship. All those other ones, they're pretenders. And it was a way to let people know what was really worth paying attention to. We were always pretty exclusive with that list. It's grown a bit over the years. You know, and people have mixed feelings about that, and I can understand that. But to me, it's kind of just a way of honoring and giving respect to the championships out there that really mean something for different reasons. The championship that Trish has, absolutely prestigious for many reasons. And that's landed her in the overall weekly top 10. Why wouldn't it? You know? So
bringing things really current, the genesis of the PWI 500 has always been, I don't know, I don't want to say problematic, but controversial. Definitely a conversation starter. Let's say that, a conversation.
Absolutely. It's all those things.
And tell us, we already know that there's been like a behind the scenes committee that sort of hashes this out. So tell us first where that committee of individuals comes from.
Well, the committee of individuals is all in the instance of the 500. It's everybody is a staff writer. When I say that, it's not all of us are here in the office and we're scattered all over the place. But everybody is a regular contributor and is listed on the masthead in the magazine. Not everybody gets invited to the table for that. I know it took me quite a few years before I was invited. I think I'd been writing for the magazine 4 or 5 years before I was at my first 500 meeting. Harry Burkett is a senior writer. Al Castle is a senior writer. They've both been in the meetings longer than I have. Mike Bessler is in the committee, another just longtime contributing writer. Brian Solomon, who previously wrote for WWF magazine, one of our most active contributing writers, and also podcast host for the PWI podcast, cheap plug. He is also
a cheap plug, so don't worry about the cheap plug.
As of the last couple of years, he's been in the meetings. Other than that, we've kind of rotated people in and out. We actually asked a couple of the people who'd been in the meetings in recent years to kind of take a step back, not because they weren't worth being in the meetings, but just as you invite new people in, it gets a little cluttered. We still invited them to send in their feedback. But this year we had Righteous Reg and Kristen Ashley, who've both been doing amazing work for the magazine, not just in the magazine, but content, extra interviews they've been doing, all this work. And, you know, I think they both bring valuable perspectives to the table. Kristen was a big advocate for women being better represented on the list. And Reg, of course, is the creator of the Black Wrestling's 500. So, I mean, he's staunch advocate for Black wrestlers and any wrestlers of color to be on the list.
So we're going to start because the number one, literally number one thing that people have been talking about is this debate between Omega and Reigns. And you said there was a great deal of debate behind the scenes. So tell us what that debate looked like and some of the factors that went into Kenny Omega eventually being named the #1 wrestler of the year.
The way I perceived it, and we had this meeting over Zoom, I thought that it was close, but that Kenny, being a triple world champion, was our top guy. He was most likely going to get it. So what I did when I came in was just, okay, is there anybody who has a case for anybody besides Kenny Omega? Few people shook their heads, you know, they weren't gonna, but Al Castle made a very strong case for Roman Reigns and eventually came around in his thinking to, okay, yeah, if we're looking at the sport of wrestling, what happened in the ring, it's got to be Kenny. But the logic behind that is Roman Reigns, biggest star in WWE, best work of his career, I'd say. I don't think too many people would argue with that. I think just about any other year he wins. But the one, well, a couple of things, and I mean, these are not knocks on him, it's just advantages to Kenny here. One, I mean, it is a single championship. Granted, it is one of the most prestigious championships. I would maybe argue that the WWE championship, the original one held by Lashley, is a good deal above what the belt Roman holds, but Roman is just kind of, he is SmackDown in a way that even as good as Lashley's been, he hasn't quite been Raw. Maybe the best thing on Raw, but he's not carrying the show, so to speak. And I mean, that's also not to slight Bianca Belair, who's been doing amazing work. It's like Roman is 1 and Bianca is 1A. But Roman's work was, I mean, a lot of what people like is these storylines involved with it, and they're incredible storylines. But if you look at what he's actually doing, he'll go long stretches where he doesn't wrestle at all. If you look at just from a kayfabe level at house shows, he's losing not mixed tag matches, 6-man tag matches, which doesn't seem like it should matter, but according to our criteria, it does. And if you look at the people he's feuding with, yeah, that WrestleMania match where he beat Edge and Daniel Bryan, incredibly impressive, probably more impressive than any single win Kenny Omega had. But apart from that, Cesaro, who was kind of called up from the mid-card for that feud, feuded with Jey Uso for several months, maybe the best feud all year. But is that really high level in-ring competition. Jey Uso was a tag team guy before that. He has his highest ranking ever this year on the basis of working with his cousin, working with Roman. So again, none of these are knocks. These are just kind of, okay, you could argue that Roman Reigns is just doing this transformative work. He's doing it at a higher level than Kenny Omega is because more people are watching it. Yes, I hear all that. But ultimately, it kept coming back to, we're Pro Wrestling Illustrated. We're not Pro Promo Illustrated. We're not Pro Storyline Illustrated. And Kenny Omega, Impact World Champion, AEW World Champion, AAA Mega Champion. I don't know how you compete with that.
Yeah, I am going to tell you that from my perspective, like I would also understand how one could be torn, because if you're looking at the actual criteria of like the breadth of competition, things of that nature, I agree with you, Kenny Omega. I think that in terms of the storyline work, definitely Reigns has the strongest storyline. But
Agreed.
If you're going exclusively on some kind of a criteria that would be happening between, in the squared circle, right? So the other question that some people seem to have, tell us a little bit about how Rich Swann made your cut for the top 10.
So Rich Swann, the argument there, again, this goes back to the world title designations. And Impact did not have world title status with PWI. It was taken away back in 2015 or 2016. That was at the point, some people were upset about that even when it happened. But the truth was, that was when Impact was inactive for the better part of a year. They taped a bunch of shows and that was it. No TV deal at the time. That company, even though there's been plenty of good matches and storylines since then, kind of fell into obscurity a little bit. And we viewed Rich's reign as a real turning point. Not just because he feuded with Kenny Omega, not just because he had these good matches, but because he really reinvented himself. He was this cruiserweight competitor in WWE. Even in Impact, he was this tag team guy, essentially, when he came in. But he came back from injury and then was immediately credible at the top of the card. His in-ring skills have been very good. But ultimately, I think he stepped in the ring with Kenny Omega, looked credible, again, lost to him. But that storyline, even in defeat, it did so much for Impact. And I think he has to get a lot of the credit for that, just purely from what he did in the ring and what he did to elevate the company this year. That was our thinking.
I mean, I think he had the best year of his career, and I think that there was a lot of effort there, but I'm still not sold on him in the top 10. And
that's the thing. So this is subjective. We're not doing mathematical formulas here. We're getting together and debating as a group. Not even everybody in the group wanted him in the top 10. I think a few of us felt good about it, and other people were like, was he quite top 10 material this year? Looking at it now, I think we have a pretty solid top 10. You could debate the order on a few of the guys. I would put him at number 10. I think that's a good spot for him. Another part, I'm not sure who I'd replace him with. And it's not that nobody else had a great year, but if we're looking at this combination of criteria, championships, wins, losses, influence, breadth of competition, activity, I don't know who goes above him. And that's not to say he's in there by default. I think he's a strong choice. I don't know. Who would you put at number 10?
I'm not sure, but he just,
but not him.
But and this is where you and I having a conversation here and it going to publish on Wrestling Inc. And my stating this is likely to have people pop off. You know how it is. Like if I'm sitting here saying I don't think that I would have ranked him in that spot, then I become a Rich Swann hater in people's minds, and that's not the case. I just think that
you may think he was top 20 or 30 even or 40.
I think that he's definitely a top 20. Because of everything that you said. But to me, as great as what he did previously was, I would take for example, the accomplishments that he had an Impact and say, well, here we are like 2 months, 3 months, 4 months later, and he's embroiled on the losing end of a tag team feud with the Good Brothers.
No, that's valid. And if that's one thing with the criteria is that it is for a set period of time, and people kind of lose that sometimes. And we always run that risk that somebody could just be completely buried by the time the issue comes out.
Yeah.
But that's why we emphasize the evaluation period. And through the end of June, he was still very much in the mix. He wasn't champion any longer, but he was, again, still doing really well. And overall had this fantastic year that I, again, think really helped elevate the company. But I mean, we've had people say things later, like I think last year, what was it? Randy Orton had a very middling ranking last year. He's number 12 this year. He won the WWE championship after the evaluation period ended. And people said, why isn't Randy Orton top 10? And like this issue, first of all, came out a month and a half ago. We're not psychic. But it's also, we can't reflect the current status. That's why we have this evaluation period. Some people would rather we put this out at the very end of the year. Cover date, that's what it is. It's the December issue.
Right.
PWI, like many other magazines, and PWI probably more so than many other magazines, just dates things way in advance. I don't fully understand it. I've kind of said, even just internally here, do we need to have this one this far out? But there's a reason they do it. I don't understand it, and it's above my level of knowledge. But our company has been the parent company does very well in the magazine marketplace. They know what they're doing, so I trust them. Anyway, side tangent there. Basically, if we were to make it January through December, we would have to work really quickly to get that out so that people would still be talking about it as a year-end list. And then two, I mean, this is just kind of when we started doing it years ago. It wasn't a year-end list. We did, however, have the year-end awards, which predate PWI entirely. Those go back to the early 70s. So, for better or worse, I mean, you don't have to like the evaluation period, the criteria, or the list. But we try to stay consistent to all those things, true to them.
Another individual I think that seems to have popped off and people questioning it, Kota Ibushi. So like I'm curious about that one.
So people would put Kota Ibushi, is it that they would put him higher than where he is?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, Kota Ibushi, like higher than where he's ranked at the moment.
Okay, so he's at number 5. And I do think, given that he won the G1 Climax, won the championship at Wrestle Kingdom, defended it successfully the next night, I think you could look at that and say that he is top 3. But the truth is, he had that title, and we went over this on the PWI podcast as well too. It always sounds like I'm tearing people down, or whoever's talking about this is tearing people down. This is just like, oh, here's where their weakness is versus the person who's ranked above them, because we know what the strengths are. Kota Ibushi had a fantastic year, first recognized IWGP World Heavyweight Champion when they, rechristened the double gold belt as that. But he only defended that title, I believe it was one successful defense. And then after that kind of fell by the wayside. He was unable to compete for a little bit. Never really ascended back into that world title picture. That was the thing with New Japan this year, because I think they didn't really have one single top guy. It really was split over a few different people, which is why you saw 3 different New Japan guys in the top 10.
Interestingly enough, Kenny Omega tweeted something, you've seen this popping off on social media where
the Ospreay thing.
Yeah, where Kenny Omega's like, somebody should have stepped up. Like I thought somebody would step up. And I think that speaks to the fact that he was such a megastar there, that when he left to go and focus on AEW, that they've had to replace him with multiple parties.
Yeah, and I mean, I think some of that is circumstantial. I mean, obviously Ospreay got hurt. I think they were probably planning to keep the belt on him for a little while. Shingo Takagi stepped up, has been doing some of the best, arguably the best in-ring work in terms of match quality in the whole industry right now. But Kenny, as much as he said that on Twitter to come back and dunk on Ospreay, he did admit in the interview I had with him, which is on the podcast, but it's also excerpted in the magazine, and this is one of the things that's printed. He didn't think he ran away with the number 1. He agrees with everybody else that this is a close race. It could have been Roman. It could have been Ospreay. It could have been Shingo Takagi. And you look at that, even he himself, I believe, said if Ospreay had not gotten injured, I don't know that Ospreay would have been number one if he, even delivering at the level he was, continuing to wrestle. If he'd had, he won the championship, I believe it was in the spring. So there's the evaluation period to consider. He probably wouldn't have had a ton more successful defenses. Won the New Japan Cup, but I think he was at a good spot at number 7. I do think that New Japan, part of it's circumstantial, part of it's bad luck. Japan has had periodic shutdowns. Like they've had a lot of, okay, these events are going to have to be postponed for a few weeks. That's happened several times since the pandemic started. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that works against them. That's, not anybody's fault. But I think even apart from that, just they've really been taking a different creative direction. The introduction of this new title, even before that, I mean, the fact that Evil suddenly ascended and won the double gold last year, I mean, that's the sign of a company that's trying to figure things out. And I think they still do a lot of good things, but I do think they're in sort of a transitional period right now as well.
So we also have upcoming, I mean, you no sooner finish with this controversy and then you get ready to go into the next one. So we've got upcoming, we have you did the women not too long ago. So the women are sort of on the back burner at the moment. Is that correct?
So we have the list. The evaluation period is technically still ongoing. We figure that probably there's not a lot of seismic change that's going to happen between now and then, but we will adjust as needed. That list is going up to 150 this year. That comes out next month. So kind of right now we're working on the issue, recognizing that, probably some people, it's safe to say they're going to stay on the list. We may need to tweak their bios or their numbers. We have to be a little more cautious toward the bottom part of that list because there's a possibility someone else will need to be put onto the list at some point. So yeah, it is kind of tricky. And then we have the tag team issue, which will be coming out after that. Last year that was 50. We may increase the number this year. We're going to have to look and see how many really viable tag teams are out there.
I mean, money, power. I'm representing my team here, but
is that what this is about?
No,
is that why you invited me on?
It's not about that. But because these are what this is about is the fact that it's well-known fact to you and to anybody who follows me on social media that Pro Wrestling Illustrated was such an integral part, and I think this speaks to anybody who grew up in the era of the 80s, 90s, where Pro Wrestling Illustrated was really the source that we had. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have those things. So when you are looking at things like the women's 150 or the tag team top 50, I think that we definitely understand that, even if you didn't go outside of the major companies, we could probably find the better part of a couple hundred of the men, right? We've got them there. But when it comes to looking beyond the most obvious locations for these talents, how do y'all go about that?
So specifically talking, say, the women's list?
The women's list, I mean, there's, I think about, you're talking about Righteous Red, she comes up with the Black 500. So these are things that are, it takes a lot of work to go and source and find, and then start to discuss placement of hundreds of wrestlers.
I mean, so we do ask for help with that. We have submission forms that we put up. I didn't mention this with the 500, but I should mention it, is that we asked people to consult on certain parts of the list. We have Striga, who works one of the integral parts of Cage Match and Pearl Love and a few other, he has Eastern Lariats, his podcast. Really on top, especially of men's wrestling in Japan. So he always submits his thoughts and we take those into consideration. They're not the be all end all, but we take them heavily into consideration. Chris Zellner helps us out with the Mexican ratings. We have Marek Indica, who's been helping out with Australian ratings for the weekly, the monthly, and the 500. Same deal.
I saw Canadians come in. Is that correct?
What's it? Oh, yeah. Canadian list is coming up. We haven't quite worked out the details on that yet. Canadian wrestling is just finally starting to come back. I mean, even look at the 500, there are not many Canadians, or at least Canadians who are not competing in the US on there. And we did look, and we did place a couple of Canadians on there, but it was very, very inactive. Yeah. So we do ask for help in these areas where we don't necessarily have feet on the ground. to be observing this. I mean, like, we have a lot of contributors throughout the US and we have a pretty good handle on that. And it's not to say we aren't following the action in these other countries. It's just that it's good to have someone who is paying even more close attention.
Of course,
Um,
specialists.
yeah, and I mean, for the women's list, so what we did, Kristen Ashley is on the committee again this year. Candace Cordelia, who's one of our newer contributors, is also on, as is Pat LaPrade, who was on last year, who knows a ton about women's wrestling, co-wrote Sisterhood of the Square Circle with Dan Murphy, who was a longtime senior writer for PWI. He was on the committee last year and this year, but we invited a few new people in this year who are not current staff writers for PWI to help with the list, to give those different perspectives, who are more familiar with the independent scene, who are more familiar with Joshi, for example. And it's really pretty easy to rank 150 women. I think people are going to be surprised at some of the omissions, even in WWE and AEW. Again, not knocks on these wrestlers. It's just when you look at things like activity, championships are maybe not weighed quite as heavily. They're still very important, but there are fewer championships out there for women. So someone could still do very well on the women's 150, getting used to saying the new number, without necessarily having a championship. But if someone is kind of lower mid-card in WWE, should they really outrank somebody who had a great year in Japan or Mexico or any number of US states? I don't know about that. And we did have those conversations this year.
Yeah, it's very interesting, especially with the women, because as we went back to the earlier conversation, so many of the women that I know in the world of professional wrestling compete in what I guess others would call intergender matches, but they just wrestle whatever companies, whoever's 100%. There, right? So and they do very well. And you mentioned Ali specifically, and Ali Catch, actually, I was just with the weekend with her. So,
cool.
And it was one of the few weekends where I saw her mostly wrestle women, because usually she doesn't. So,
right.
So tell us a little bit, just sort of like to bring it to a close, to be respectful of your time.
Sure.
Tell us what changes with the magazine that have not been made yet, but that you would like to see coming in the future.
That's a good question, especially because when I have a thought or someone else makes a good suggestion, I do try to implement it as quickly as I can. Ideally, I think one day it would be great to just have this completely integrated PWI 500. I don't think we're there yet. I think if we do that, and I'm sure we'll be talking about this more soon. We talked about doing a Twitter space about this. But if we do it, women who are doing very, very well are going to do really well against a field of men. Even if there's no possibility of them wrestling, you can look and objectively say they had this championship, they won this tournament, they may have this show. But the reality is that women have fewer titles to compete for, fewer tournaments, less TV time. So I think if we completely get rid of those distinctions between the two lists and don't have this division-based approach, that could end up giving some really kind of middling rankings to higher level competitors. That doesn't make any sense to me. But I think, all else being equal, I think it would be great to get there one day. I think that's probably at least a few years off, but we'll see. Maybe the industry improves a lot and starts promoting women's wrestling the way it should be, promoting everybody the way that it should be. But apart from that, something I would like to do, we reintroduced the supercards concept this year. It was the perfect time to do it because there were all these big events at once out of necessity because of COVID. I mean, you had events that were supposed to take place in the spring that took place in December. I would love to do an annual supercards issue. I want to cover more international wrestling, European wrestling. We haven't really had any feature stories on Mexico in a while. We've been getting a little better with Japan, and we'll continue to feature more Japanese wrestlers. But that's my goal, just cover more of wrestling as an international sport, art form, attraction, the way PWI always has. That's my goal.
I think that's a great goal too. I remember one of the things I remember reading is that somebody commented that since you came on board, that it has become a much more indie focused publication. And I just felt when that person said that, I was like, you obviously haven't really paid attention to this for very long, because I remember all of they were larger indie promotions, but they were always a significant part of Pro Wrestling Illustrated and its sister company or sister publications throughout the years. So
no, I agree. And especially if you go back to the territory days, because none of those companies were owned by, it was Titan Sports was really the first one. And then at least in the US. And I mean, even as the indies became more like, they weren't as much of a focus as they are today, but post territories, indie wrestlers were always showing up in the magazines. If you look at the different, short interviews, 12 questions features, photo pinups. Yeah, again, it's always been there. And even if you look at the early days of the women's ranking, which had the regrettable name of Female 50 at first, people like alliteration, I guess. Shimmer wrestlers were always featured very heavily in that. Shine wrestlers, I'm going to forget different, but WSU, and there were many other women's promotions throughout the years that got featured.
LPWA, the ill-fated.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So there's the truth is it's been there, but I do think maybe it's been a little bit more of a focus. Indie wrestlers didn't. I remember years ago. I wrote a story. It was like my second or third piece for the magazine. It wasn't even PWI. I had to like work my way up to PWI. I started with the Wrestler Inside Wrestling Combo magazine because that was sort of like slightly less prestigious at that point, because PWI has been the flagship since it came out in 1979. It was about Rob Eckos and Dan Eckos. Rob Eckos is Robert Stone of the NXT. And Dan Eckos, I don't know if he's still there. He was a ref for NXT for quite a while. But they had this brother versus brother feud in ECWA, who runs the annual Super 8 show, which, by the way, we've been covering for pretty much as long as it's been around, usually in a prominent way. 25th anniversary of that this year, which is very cool. And I wrote this story, and I remember Stu was kind of reluctant, like, I feel like people don't know who some of these independent wrestlers are, but there's some really compelling storylines. And when one gets across my desk, I want to feature it. And this is a good, really relatable storyline. And I remember I even needed to do a couple of rewrites on it because I didn't have that human element that Stu really wanted in it. And that I really, as an editor, that's absolutely what I want to see now, is that human element. I want to see wrestling covered, as a sport, as an art form, but also just like why you should care about this particular thing. And I'm rambling, but that's what I do. The ECWA storyline got me thinking, like, years ago, like, oh, they really don't cover indie wrestling all that much. So like there's that perception, but why not? Why not do a story about, we did a feature about Nick Gage last year. We were hardly the first person to interview him, but it predated the Dark Side of the Ring episode by quite a few months. We had a really good story on AJ Gray that Righteous Reg wrote. Twitter Seahawk, Cam Hawkins wrote a great piece about Alley Catch, making that transformation a few months ago from this kind of more comedic gimmick to this serious catch wrestler. There's so many cool stories out there to tell. And I think if there are months where there's not as much indie coverage, it's only because there's other stuff that we are also trying to fit in there. There's so much good wrestling. I get so fed up when people say there's no good wrestling anymore. Come on, like, you're not working. Like, even if you only like really, really old school wrestling, outside of if you want to watch, like, I don't know, like a Jimmy Londas match or something like that, there's something out there for you. Like the NWA is very prominent and has this really old school style, but there's contemporary stuff in there. You're going to see a couple of high flying moves, but like, how could you not like that? How could you not like some of the, the European promotions that do more of a throwback style, not even throwback style, but just classic wrestling, right?
Yeah.
So I want PWI to at least do its part to help introduce people to that, because if people really think there's no wrestling out there for them anymore, then either they've just completely, to quote Shawn Michaels, lost their smile, or we're not doing our job.
Right.
We should connect people to this. That's growing up. I watched WWF and WCW on TV. the territory days were kind of waning at that point. It was right near the end of them. But there were wrestlers I'd never heard of before, and then I went and checked out just because I read about them in PWI and The Wrestler and Inside Wrestling. You know, like, why can't we go
Absolutely
to that?
correct. I'm the same way.
You know about it? Yeah, you've been a reader of the magazines for years. You know this, and it's we've had conversations about it. And by the way, just really glad to have helped you achieve that goal of getting published in the magazine. Your work's awesome. Happy to work with you again in the future. I mean, that was just a really good piece, a very unconventional piece that you knocked out very quickly and did an amazing job on. So congrats on that. That was,
thank you.
Well deserved.
For the viewers or the listeners, depending on which format you're listening to this in, the October issue 2021, I do have a story in Pro Wrestling Illustrated covering the feud between Ricochet and Ali on Main Event. Go pick up that episode or issue of the publication. So, well, Kevin, thank you for joining us. I appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity to pick your brain about what it was that went into the 500. The success is definitely there for this issue because people are talking about it, buzzing about it. They want to see it. So congratulations on that. And I hope for perhaps less of a headache when it comes to the rankings, but I know that's not going to happen. I know that the rank in the women's 150 is going to be
fine. If that's why I get headaches, I'm happy to get headaches that way. It's a job's a total pleasure.
So, well, thank you. It has been a total pleasure for me to talk to you here on the video, and thanks for joining us.